Welcome to today's Philanthropy Roundtable debate between two fantastic scholars, Leslie Harris, a professor of history and African American studies at Northwestern University, and John McWhorter, who teaches linguistics at Columbia University, hosts the podcast Lexicon Valley, and writes at many fine publications, including one where you ought to subscribe. That's The Atlantic. I'm Conor Friedersdorf, your moderator, and as it happens, a staff writer at The Atlantic. Complete coincidence. I won't shamelessly plug it again because our subject today concerns a rival publication. Last year, the New York Times Magazine dedicated a special issue to what it called the 1619 Project, a collection of articles, photographs, and other materials that mark the 400th anniversary of August 19th, 1619. On that date, 20 enslaved Africans were sold to English colonists in what would become the state of Virginia. The project attempted, and here I'll quote from the Times website, to reframe the country's history by placing the consequences of slavery and the contributions of Black Americans at the very center of our national narrative. The project's lead essay by the journalist Nicole Hannah-Jones would go on to win a Pulitzer Prize. The Pulitzer Center developed a 1619 project curriculum for public schools. Janice Johnson, the head of Chicago's public school system, said that the project resonated with many Black students, helping them to see the great contributions that enslaved people and their descendants made to American history, rather than being ashamed of this country or their place within it. And the project has sparked countless debates among historians, journalists, and others, including President Donald Trump, who suggested that it ought to be banned from public schools. Among critics who've read the 1619 Project, some disputes concern matters of fact or historical interpretation. Perhaps we'll touch on some of them. But the focus of many debates, and our debate today, concerns a claim not about what happened in the past, but about what ought to happen today and in the future. In a short essay introducing the 1619 Project, Jake Silverstein, the editor of the New York Times Magazine, wrote this, quote, 1619. It is not a year that most Americans know as a notable date in our country's history. Those who do are at most a tiny fraction of those who can tell you that 1776 is the year of our nation's birth. What if, however, we were to tell you that this fact, which is taught in our schools and unanimously celebrated every 4th of July, is wrong, and that the country's true birth date, the moment that its defining contradictions first came into the world, was in late August of 1619? Later, in multiple public appearances, Silverstein and Jones argued that 1619 should be considered America's true founding. Many critics published articles contesting that suggestion and arguing that 1776 ought to remain the year that we consider America's true symbolic founding. Although these debates all began back in August 2019, they continue today in the pages of the New York Times, where columnist Bret Stephens just published a column airing criticism of the project, among conservative intellectuals, some of whom have called for the Pulitzer Prize Committee to withdraw the project's award, among leadership at the New York Times, which just put out statements praising and standing by the project, and among the project's many fans who stand by it as well. And here today, we're lucky to have Professors Harris and McWhorter to delve deeper into the debate between 1619 and 1776. You've each got 3 minutes to make opening statements. I flipped a coin earlier, and Professor Harris will go first.
Hi, everyone. Conor, thank you for that lovely introduction. And you should know that I made my subscription to The Atlantic this morning. Thank you to the Philanthropy Roundtable for inviting me to be part of this conversation. And I'm really looking forward to the discussion with you and with John McWhorter. So I want to start with the idea of the date 1619, but also more generally the idea of dates. Historians and the general public have often used dates other than 1776 to mark the quote-unquote founding of American ideals, or to include themselves in the nation inaccurately or not. For example, 1620, the Pilgrim's Landing. When I was a child, that was the date where we began talking about American history. It was a way to situate American founding ideals in religious freedom, rather than perhaps the more chronologically accurate and logical 1607, Jamestown. That would have situated America in commerce and land ownership. The Virginians at this early time were not very interested in religion as a foundational element of their settling of North America. Another date that was important and continues to be important in history classes, of course, 1492, Columbus's arrival in the quote-unquote New World. But we know that the emphasis on that date is part of an effort by Italian Americans in the early 20th century to be included in the nation's story. Some other less well-known dates: as a Southerner, I visited St. Augustine, Florida when I was a child, and I learned that 1565 was the date of St. Augustine, Florida's founding, and it carries the designation as the oldest quote-unquote city in the US, and that is important for Florida. And there are earlier histories of Florida that are also linked to slavery. More recently, historians have begun to talk about the second founding of the Civil War era, rooted in the ways in which the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments solidified the end of slavery, clarified who determined citizenship for the nation, and also made access to the vote on non-racial terms. 1619 has had importance in the African American community at least since the 1960s, and it was a date that I knew of as a child. Lerone Bennett's 1962 work, Before the Mayflower, was an attempt to solidify Black Americans' presence on the continent. And again, the reference to the Mayflower shows how important 1620 was at that point. Malcolm X in 1964 took up this idea and said, "We didn't land on Plymouth Rock, the rock landed on us." I read the use of 1619 in the 1619 Project as a polemical device, a what if, a way to refocus the nation's attention to how people of African descent and the system of slavery that developed in the Americas led to North American and US particularly successes economically and politically. It also led to some great failures, of course: the continuation of slavery, the legacy of racism, our continuing struggle with equity in terms of race and class, and our continuing struggle with the meaning and practice of democracy. In fact, I took this question of 1619, 1776, or any other dates to my doctoral students this year, not because I expected a yes or no answer to 1619 or 1776, but because such questions lead us to ask new questions, to think of old ideas in new ways, and to generate new ideas. The over-the-top rhetoric about the dangers of the project and its alleged misuses of history have obscured its creativity. Are we so afraid to step into the space of 1619 or 1776 creatively? I hope not, and I hope we get to talk today about what that means to do so. Thank you.
All right, Professor McWhorter.
Thank you to the Philanthropy Roundtable for inviting me, and I'm honored to be here with Dr. Harris, who I have known since we were graduate students together, and of course my colleague at the Atlantic, Conor Friedersdorf. I think that my take on the 1619 controversy is perhaps somewhat more local, but the whole episode has worried me, and it's partly because of issues historiographical, such as Dr. Harris has mentioned, but there's been more involved as far as I was concerned. And so it seems to me that we can't forget that the fundamental claim of the 1619 Project is that the Revolutionary War was fought over slavery. That's the claim. And the issue is that true? And the reason that it's important to stress that is because, for example, it's not that Nicole Hannah-Jones was responsible for showing that anyone who had anything to say about the Revolutionary War was concerned with slavery. The issue is whether it was a dominant issue, and that's what she says. And we have to face an inconvenient fact, which is that without that particular claim, of course, the 1619 Project has various presentations, but without that particular claim, it wouldn't have the attention that it does. It wouldn't be shaping our historiographical discussion in any way. And as much as I hate to say it, Nicole Hannah-Jones wouldn't have gotten the Pulitzer without that earth-shattering claim. Earth-shattering because if that's true, then we really should revise what we think of as the American project. And I have to say, the fact that they phrased it as imagine if has to be taken as the very deft and effective rhetorical device that it was. But we can't say that because she phrased it as imagine that she isn't responsible for the statement. And here's why. She said imagine, and a great many, frankly, rather august people said that no, the Revolutionary War was not fought over the slavery question. Now, suppose people had simply said, yes, we should begin our country's history at 1619 because of what Nikole Hannah-Jones said, and think of 1776 as just one rather complex year. Would she have objected? No. Would she have said, no, I only said just imagine? No. Let's face it. So, this is the issue. When people in positions of authority say that it's okay for a black scholar to make a claim as nervy as that one and say that our founding should be placed at 1619 when Africans were brought up onto the beach, rather than to enshrine 1776 as the philosophically interesting and unprecedented phenomenon that it was, to allow that she can say that and not be corrected, that when she's corrected in the public square, it's okay for her to just say in various ways that the criticism comes from racism, and for her to be let pass with that statement, is racist. I know that a lot of people think they're demonstrating their anti-racism by not holding her responsible, but instead it creates a different kind of racism. I doubt she perceives it, but I do, and it disgusts me.
All right, we're going to move into some questions. Professor Harris, I want to begin with you. You mentioned that you wanted to talk about how you wish people had reacted to the 1619 project and the rhetorical device that it used in your view. And I wonder, what do you find to be the biggest shortcomings of the conversation we've had? And if someone takes issue with the 1619 project, as Professor McWhorter does, or as many other people have on many different grounds, what do you think would be the constructive way to critique it that perhaps would improve on what you've seen and felt badly about?
Thanks. That's a great question. I think the most disappointing response to the project has been to focus on only Nikole Hannah-Jones's essay, and within that essay, focus on one line. And the focus on that one line where she claims that the Revolutionary War was fought to defend slavery, that focus really detracts from an exploration of many other things that she says in the essay that are interesting, that are about her personal reflection, and then many other things in the 1619 project, the whole magazine issue as a whole. So I too, as I've written, I was disturbed by the misstatement in that line, in my opinion, as an historian. But I don't think that it impugns the whole project. And I wish that people would move beyond that and talk about some of the other issues that are raised in the 1619 project. There's a wonderful essay on, for example, medical care by Linda Villarosa, which talks about the ways in which medical doctors in the antebellum period thought that African Americans were distinctive physically, and the ways that those practices and beliefs still affect our medical care today. And this is something that scientists, doctors, and many others have been talking about. And that's only one example. There are many more essays in the project than Nikole Hannah-Jones's essay, and much more history in the 1619 Project magazine as a whole. So I've been disappointed by that focus on just her essay. One more thing I'll say is that when teachers teach from a document like the 1619 Project, we don't take it completely at face value. The phrase critical thinking is central to teaching in all schools that I know of, high school, college. My students come in as freshmen talking about bias constantly. What is the bias in this article? The 1619 Project, imperfect as it is a great teaching tool for all of the reasons that people have been discussing over the past year.
Thank you. Professor McWhorter, you're far from alone in talking about the relationship between slavery and the American Revolution, or the lack of relationship between slavery and the American Revolution. There was a socialist website that focused very heavily on this. They felt that they needed to defend the American Revolution for reasons very particular to their ideology. Could you talk a little bit about why you think that that line was not only incorrect, but significant broadly within the project, and why it matters whether people think that the American Revolution was or wasn't motivated partly by a desire to protect slavery. We are living all of these years later. People do seem to think it matters in colleges, some protesters. What are the stakes? Why does it matter what narrative we are taught about this time?
Well, it comes back to the whole issue of what I think is a creeping sense among even the white intelligentsia in this country that Black people are not quite as bright, and that the best that we can do is maybe speak rather well and show up. So part of the reason that I think that that particular one claim is one that we have to really pay attention to is because it is what has gotten the whole project attention, and it is getting a lot of attention. And so the question is, was the person who put this forth correct or not? And if it turns out that it wasn't correct and that this is said by seasoned historians, and I'm quite aware that I'm not one, but I've seen that seasoned historians have said that that's not correct, then it is our civic responsibility to call that person on it, whether or not they are a descendant of slaves who came to this country. And more to the point, something else. We're not supposed to talk about this, but the American experiment has been a very complex thing. And the whole general idea that the main story that we need to tell is the story, no matter how hideous, of what has happened to the descendants of African slaves here is vastly oversimplified. There's been a whole history of the United States that's gotten a lot of attention recently that I was very disappointed in by one of my heroes, Jill Lepore. I read everything she writes in The New Yorker. I've read literally all of her books, including that one. That was the only one I was disappointed in because I saw her as doing a certain genuflection to the idea that to look at American history, we must look only to the fact that people in 1776 were not fully fulfilling the mission of treating individuals with dignity. The fact is, part of complexity is that history happens in increments. History is a grand rehearsal. People rarely end up accomplishing perfectly what they put into documents. And we're told that we're supposed to suspend our judgment. We're supposed to suspend our engagement with complexity when it comes to the one question of what was going on with African slaves and their descendants, as if our whole sense of morality, or more to the point, just our sense of empiricism and what a complex thing social history is supposed to go out the window. And honestly, it's condescending, because I am quite sure, because I am giving full respect to the people who are letting this sort of thing pass. They understand that social history is complicated, but I really fear that they think that Nicole Hannah-Jones can't be held to that standard, that Black people can't be held to that standard. Now, very quickly, part of it is that they're scared. Nobody wants to be called a racist in the public square. That's part of it. But what people don't understand is that in hiding and cringing in their homes so that nobody articulate and probably Black will call them a racist on Twitter, they're creating a different kind of racism by absolving both Black people, not to mention America, from engaging the complex thing that American social history is. That's why this offends me, because once again, and I'm not just trying to beat the same drum, it's that Black people are being treated as dim. I must crusade against that, even if it gets me called anti-Black. It's not, it's pro-Black. So I understand everything Professor Harris is saying fully. But I do think we need to pay attention to that one thing, because if it weren't for that one thing, we wouldn't be having this conversation, because that's why that package is being given to students to study the other parts of. And it's why it was given the Pulitzer that gives it the imprimatur to continue being treated that way. I mean, wait for the movie next. We have to talk about what the central driving claim was.
Thank you. Professor Harris, Professor McWhorter has been talking a little bit about different pressures that inform the way people talk about this debate and engage in it. And I've been struck writing about it that almost every faction in the debate feels itself to be the underdog. So the socialist website thinks, man, there's so much taught about the history of slavery and the founding and the Civil War, and no one ever talks about the workers' movement. That's what kids should be learning about, right? And conservatives feel as though it's liberals that are controlling the education system, and Nicole Hannah-Jones feels that she's being attacked by this Republican president in a way that is unfair. And I'm struck that one central claim of the 1619 Project is that children haven't been taught this narrative about 1619 adequately, haven't been taught adequately about slavery and its enduring impact. I honestly don't know if those observations are as apt today as they were in bygone eras in American education or not. I know my own Catholic high school education in the 1980s. I grew up in a pretty conservative place in Orange County, California, and we watched Roots and we read Beloved, and we learned about sharecroppers during Reconstruction. And I don't know if that was typical or atypical. And I wonder, when you survey what Americans are taught both in the classroom and in popular culture, what do you think about the 1619 Project? Is it best understood as a necessary addendum to a kind of failure in the primary narrative? Or is it best understood as the main narrative that people are being taught about American history now?
Thanks. That's a great question. I have thought about this a lot, and particularly in terms of the response to the 1619 Project, but also in terms of how it got created. And I have to say that both as a college teacher, as someone who has worked in NEH seminars with K through 12 teachers who are looking to deepen their understanding of slavery and of African American history, and just in conversation with friends who have children, that there still is a gap in terms of when students come to my classroom, when I talk to those K through 12 teachers, there is a big gap in terms of what's being taught in the classroom in terms of slavery, that there really is a lack. And I think that some of the more tendentious claims of the 1619 Project are a response to that lack. There is, to me, a big gap between what is happening in academia, what happens, say, in my college classroom, versus what happens to kids in K through 12. I don't think there's been a time that I've taught the African American History Survey that I haven't had a student come up to me. And this is both when I taught at Emory in Atlanta and recently when I taught here in Chicago at Northwestern, and said, one, I have never heard any of this history. I didn't know that, I didn't know anything about the transatlantic slave trade. I didn't know about Southern slavery. And two, the other thing that I hear is we were made to watch Gone with the Wind, the 1939 film, Gone with the Wind, as an historical document and as historical fact. And this is literally my first year teaching at Northwestern. I had a student who I think was from Missouri who said that to me, that in high school she was watching Gone with the Wind. So Conor, I think you were very lucky. I do know high school teachers who, and high schools that are particularly well-resourced, that have their students read Beloved, that go more deeply into primary sources around slavery. But the Washington Post actually did an article around the same time the 1619 Project came out, and it surveyed and interviewed teachers and students about what they know and what they teach about slavery. And again, the results were not good. There is a big gap and a wide variation in terms of the teaching of the history of slavery. Let me say one more thing. Part of that gap between academia and the general public is that in the late 1980s, early 1990s, there was an effort to put forward national history standards. And Lynn Cheney was then the head of the NEH, and she thought that those standards, which sought to integrate not only African American history, but Native American history, some of the African American heroes like Harriet Tubman during the Civil War, just to have a more complex history about who all these people were and how they came to understand the meaning of America. She thought it was too negative, that discussing slavery was too negative, focusing on Harriet Tubman and not some of the presidents. And so she kiboshed the whole thing. Now, 100,000 copies were still printed. Teachers themselves bought these copies. And so I think there are teachers who used those new history standards, which had been requested not as a requirement by the federal government, but as a way to bring some of the new histories into and make them accessible to schools. Some teachers did take that. But much like is happening with the 1619 Project, Lynn Cheney and others focused on a few things that they disagreed with and saw it as a way to push aside the whole project. And so we continue to have a gap between what academic historians have learned about slavery, about the meaning of race, about our founding fathers to some degree, a gap between what we know at the college level and what gets taught in our schools. And that is too bad.
Professor McWhorter, I'd love it if you would address the same matter, whether today's young people are being taught a narrative that ought to be augmented by things like the 1619 Project, or whether it is the main narrative, and perhaps also, by extension, how we decide how much we should focus on the positive versus the negative parts of our history, stipulating that we want to teach people the whole truth. How do you decide how much of each thing to teach?
The idea that we must teach a fundamentally positive narrative strikes me as somebody who watched too much 1950s TV. I do not agree with that at all. I think that, talk about what it is to engage social history, to intelligently engage it, and to be a country that is perhaps a step ahead of the official narrative that many countries promote for themselves, is to acknowledge that a lot of things have gone hideously wrong and that they continue to. The idea is not for our history to be a celebration as if we were in, some movie in 1930, by no means. But on the other hand, I hear what Professor Harris is saying, and I don't mean to remotely imply that she is not being completely sincere. I understand what she means. That is what she has seen, and what she has seen carries considerable authority, especially as a historian. But I can't say that it squares with what I've seen, and I can't claim to be a historian in any official sense, but I teach in universities, and I know people who are under 18. It seems to me that the idea that slavery is something obscure to a critical mass of people squares more with the way things were in the 70s and into the 80s than they are now. And I just think of what we see in Hollywood, what we see celebrated by the intelligentsia and long before the 1619 Project, all sorts of things that are going on in any large city at any particular time. There comes a point when I've often found myself wondering, at what point, for example, can we say that it's not an obscure fact that there was slavery outside of the South? I live in New York City, where there are museum exhibits and archaeological digs, and it's always said, no one knows about this. After about 20 years, I start to wonder, is it really true that no one knows, or is that just what you're supposed to say as an enlightened person in order to be symbolically part of a certain struggle? And Professor Harris, I don't mean that as any kind of dig, but I mean there's a certain kind of person where sometimes I think about that. And what it really comes down to is this. And here, I'm not being a contrarian on purpose. This is something that I truly believe. I'm not sure how informed we can either expect or need the general public to be beyond a certain point about any aspect of history. I mean, we always talk about how historically ignorant Americans are, and to be honest, I would extend that to human beings in general. Most people live in the present. That's the nature of being a human being. Now, you can seek to have people understand what happened in the past, and especially how it relates to the present. But sometimes it seems to me that we're claiming it as a fundamental assumption that we want all Americans who've been anywhere near a school to be able to do an intelligent recitation of what has happened to Black people on these shores. And I don't mean an academic one, but I mean that even that they might be able to give a kind of an informal oral report over 10 minutes. One, I'm not sure that could ever happen because most of them couldn't give an informal oral report about when the Revolutionary War even was. We all know that. That's the nature of humanity, and Americans actually are human. And then also, I'm not sure why we need it. And by we here, I'm talking about Black people. I'm not sure that in order for Black people to overcome, all Americans need to understand what we've been through and exactly why there are the disparities today. I think there's a difference for me between politics in the present that creates a future and what sort of historically informed consciousness we're forging. And I genuinely, and I'm not putting this out as some sort of debate team point, I genuinely don't understand why the American public needs to be better informed about the history of Black people than it is roughly now, with it being more with people who go to good schools than others, certainly. There's also the thing that we don't like to talk about as Americans. There's going to be a class dimension, too. But I'm not sure why we have to work so very, very hard at that, and to see there being such a yawning gap when people can't do the kind of recitation that I talked about. I don't think they ever will be, and you can say that that's partly racist, but I'm not sure whether that matters to poor Black people who need help. So that is my real take on that question.
Yeah. Professor Harris, do you want to respond to that directly?
Yeah, I think, this is a larger question about how much education do we need in today's society. And one of the things that I look at is how complex our society is. And one of the ways that history can help us, thinking about history can help us, is it can sometimes be a practice ground for the complexities we experience in real time. But even more importantly, John's question about why do we need to know, I'm sure many of you know that the National Association of Scholars I think they have a grant. I was reading an article about it and they claim that only 15% of Americans know anything about, say, the Constitution, even our founding documents. That's a problem. That's a big problem. And it is a problem right now because we are trying to figure out, for example, what are the duties of our president, the Supreme Court, and Congress? And people are voting based on those ideas. People also vote based on their ideas of what is the meaning of race in America and how should we address that through our judicial system. They vote based on ideas, incorrect or not, about the role that African Americans have played in this country. There are people who think that African Americans, I think, did nothing to contribute to America. And so I think it's important to bring those things in. But there's a larger question here, too, about the meaning of education in an increasingly complex world. And we really, as a nation, need to reckon with the fact that we are the year 2020 has demonstrated that we need a more educated populace, not a less educated populace. And part of that education has to be an understanding of where we came from as a nation, what our ideals are, what happens when we fail, and everyone fails. This is not unique to the U.S., and how then we can overcome and continue. And those lessons are available in history and can provide some guidance if we're honest about that, as well as being available in the present. But working that historical muscle sometimes can give us a sense of how people can solve problems. One of the things that, for me, when I think about history and teaching my students is to let them know that historical actors were not perfect, even when they had these wonderful ideals. And so then how does historical change happen? We really need to have a realistic sense of, as John said, it is incremental. It doesn't happen overnight. A lot of people struggle. So what does that mean for me as an individual? What does that mean for us as a nation? What is the role of government in that? All of these things can be learned through a study of history as well as through our current experience. And we can then make informed choices about what we want to bring forward as opposed to what we want to leave behind. I just think it's part of education. It has been part of every society. We are unique, and John is right here. We are unique as a nation in our example as wanting to give education to all. That was not the case before fairly late into the 19th century. But we thought that, and we still think that, an informed citizenry is our best defense, I hope. An informed citizenry is our best defense for our national ideals. And to be informed means to know all so that we can move forward in a much better way.
Bringing us back to the central matter in this debate, the idea of 1619 and 1776 and the relationship between them, Professor Harris, is there any question that you want to put directly to Professor McWhorter about his thoughts or positions that he's expressed thus far, or just in general?
I'm curious. I mean, you're based in New York, and one of the things I was thinking is more of a response to your question about how much people know about slavery in New York. And I was very involved with an exhibition there. What has been interesting to me is that how episodic knowledge can be. That happened in 2005, that exhibition. I'm not surprised that people later don't know about it. And I guess it's this question still about how do we retain knowledge of any kind in society. Things are moving, people come and go. I guess I'm just curious about, and you're a linguist, and you've written a lot of books. I mean, do you expect that the knowledge that you put out into the world remains available and accessible? And what's the life cycle of it? I'd love to hear more about that. I know that sounds a little abstract, but it seems important to understanding these issues of slavery, which consume the nation quite literally. And so at what point do you think we should stop, talking about certain kinds of issues as a nation, not even as individuals, but as a nation?
That's an interesting question. It's not that we should ever stop, because the truth is, if you don't keep saying it, then the signal, of course, fades. So even in terms of linguistics, there are messages that we want to get out there, including thoroughly race-neutral messages, where those of us who try to do it in the public eye are often told and are often telling each other that you have to keep doing it. People on Madison Avenue know that you've got to keep running that soap commercial for 10 or 15 years. You don't run it for a month and then wonder why 10 years later nobody is buying that soap. So you've got to keep pushing it. But it seems to me that the question is often framed as no one knows anything about this, that America is in denial about slavery. And I fully get why somebody would have said that in 1975. But at this point, it's not only that there are bookshelves groaning with documentation of slavery, and a great deal of that documentation by white scholars, but it's just, at what point, like I would even put it as a different question, at what point would one say, and Leslie, I get the feeling you would say we're just not at that point, but at what point would you say that the public knows about as much about slavery as they know about the New Deal, and they know more about slavery than they do about the Spanish-American War, which they don't know existed, nor could they tell you who John C. Calhoun is. But they know about slavery, they know that there was something called Jim Crow, and frankly, after 2020, a lot more people are going to know that there's something called systemic racism or institutional racism. To me, I figure, well, that's about as good as it gets. But I sense that for many people, there's an idea that because we're talking about black people and slavery, we have to expect something more. And I'm just not sure that that could ever happen, because there's so very many things to pay attention to. And even 400 years is an awful lot of history to remember. So even to an extent, Leslie, I'm engaged in the same sort of project you are in terms of, for example, looking at the ex-slave interviews that were done in the 1930s by the Works Progress Administration, and getting the word out that you can listen to people talk about their experiences under slavery. You don't have to read a book about it. You don't have to watch 12 Years a Slave. You can listen to a person who actually went through it. These are things that people should know. But my sense of it is, well, it's only going to go so far. And my sense of it is definitely that if we want people to be better educated about these things, then our flags do have to go up when somebody makes a claim about it that simply isn't true and is told, well, that's okay, you're cute. I don't think that should be part of the general education that we promote.
Professor Harris, we've only got about 2 minutes left before we go to questions, so I'll put this last question that I raised to you. Do you think that the 1776 part of the American founding, the ideals of the Declaration, and the 1787 parts, the structure of the Constitution, are those things adequately taught today in schools, or do they also need a kind of injection in the way that some people think that the history of slavery needs an injection?
I'm never going to argue against teaching 1776, the Declaration, and the Constitution, and to the degree that we can at different points, teach the context within which these ideas happen. When we look back at that moment in history, it is definitely a signal moment for everyone who is on the North American continent. And I often teach it from the perspective of multiple different groups of people. We have, for example, enslaved people who take up the Declaration and say, oh, you're declaring freedom? So me too, and take this to court. And so there are many fascinating ways in which we can and we should teach these documents. I think that, and we can't move forward as a nation. They are our founding documents. I don't think anyone's arguing against that. But we also have to, and here I agree with John very much, we have to understand how the implementation of those documents as lived reality, the ideals as lived reality, were incremental. And so many of my colleagues, in one way or another, teach how do we get from 1776, for example, to 1865, right? So we have 1776 and then 1787, these moments of high ideals and then compromise on slavery, and then, of course, the great unraveling and the horrors of war. And we really have to be honest about the fact that that war in which so many American lives were lost, we still haven't matched it, came out of a fundamental flaw in that beginning. And that is the narrative. When I'm teaching about African American history, I'm also teaching about politics and the place in the nation. And so I always teach about the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence in my surveys through the lens of African Americans, but in the general survey, through the lens of as many people as I can bring on board who spoke about these issues. This year, 2020, the anniversary of suffrage, I would like to say out loud, Abigail Adams said, remember the ladies? They didn't get remembered again until the early 20th century, as just another example of the limits of that time.
Yeah, you've gotten me thinking about other dates that we're going to seize on in future years and decades, and what that will teach us about American history. I would love to keep asking you questions forever, but the audience needs a chance, and so I'm going to read some of their questions. First one, any comments on the fact that we have two separate museums in D.C., one for American history and one for African American history? It seems that we should be able to tell one story about American history. And John, why don't we let you start this time?
No, here's how I think it should go, if I could wave a magic wand. There should be an African American museum, and there is one. But that puts into question the whole claim that we often hear that America is in denial about the sorts of things that museum so effectively gets across. Museums like that are part of how America has become so much more enlightened about Black issues since the bad old days of as recently as 1980. So yes, that's part of what we need to do, but what worries me is if a museum like that exists, and yet there's this constant call from many people that America doesn't want to confront slavery. No? Well, then what in God's name is that building in Washington, D.C.? And let's remember that there are museums of Black history in many cities. I grew up in Philadelphia, going to one probably 2 times a year. So that's where I would put that. We do need to tell the story, but then we can't then pretend that it isn't being told.
Professor Harris, you told me earlier that you'll never argue against teaching 1776. Perhaps it's a different thing when the federal government is stepping in instead of educators at various levels. Do you have any thoughts about the new 1776 commission being set up by the Trump administration?
Well, unfortunately, the commission is also tied to statements that those teachers who use the 1619 project those school systems might lose their federal funding. So that necessarily makes me skeptical about the 1776 Commission. One of the things that many of us are very worried about is, and this may be a place of common concern, is government overreach. And this seems to be an example of government overreach. And, again, 1776 is being taught in every U.S. history course I know about. No one has stripped that away. And so I'm not clear what the 1776 Commission seeks to do except to micromanage how teachers handle these complex topics.
Yeah, Conor, may I?
Yeah, go ahead.
On this one, yes, it's definitely overreach, and it disappoints me massively. But unfortunately, it's not all their fault. And this is the single time I have ever said this about anything emanating from that administration, to the point that I'm not going to write about this because I don't want to confuse people, but I'm just going to say it here, which is that what got them going was not what we would just simply call learning and awareness of the unpleasant parts, the injustice, the racial injustice in American history. If it was just that, then we would have heard from them a long time ago. What has set them off is the excesses of this that have become particularly problematic, as they say, in 2020, where what people are taught is not just that slavery existed, et cetera, but that to be a white person in 2020 is to be integrally complicit in a racist society and should therefore be felt as a kind of original sin, that you should listen to anything that a black person says or claims, whether or not it seems to make sense, because impact matters more than intent. And then, frankly, what kicks this off also is this 1619 project coming out, where a leading claim in it, and the claim that gets it all the attention and the prizes that are awarded to it, is a false one, and yet it's allowed to pass because, God, I hate to say this, because the person who put it forth is black. And so that is what got some people in that department to the point where they thought, okay, enough of this. And then they come up with something that goes way, way too far and has all sorts of people in the country now refraining from just simply teaching racial history and even racial sensitivity. But let's face it, what we mean by racial sensitivity training in October of 2020 is quite different from what it would have meant in a default sense even just a year ago. And so it's those excesses that have ended up creating another excess. It's not wrong to think that everybody in America should not be made to read White Fragility. That's what this new thing is. The idea is that you're supposed to think of Robin DiAngelo and Ibram Kendi's work as of biblical significance. It's not wrong to question that, but the Trump administration has completely overdone it, and I don't agree with it, but it came from something that was almost equally egregious, which is the distortion of anti-racism that we have come to see in the wake of the murder of George Floyd.
I have to say, John, I really don't think that that is why. I think Trump was losing the election, and he thought, he or someone in his office thought, let's do some culture warrior work. I really find it hard to believe that 1619 Project had been out for over a year when this call from the White House, as opposed to the call of other people who had been working on this for much longer. There's a different 1776 Project. I'm not talking about that one. But the 1619 Project had been out for over a year when Trump put together this call from the White House. And I think it was grasping at straws in order to stir up his base. There are lots of controversies, and controversy is not necessarily bad. And I'll also say that many people have criticized Nicole Hannah-Jones, including myself, as you know, very honestly and openly and as quickly as I could. But the reason that the 1619 Project has gotten attention is not because of her essay alone, not at all, but because of so many other things in the New York Times Magazine that were revelatory. And when I do read some of the comments that people post on in response to different articles and things, and there are lots of people who say, I did not know. I am learning this for the first time. So anyway, we'll have to disagree on that, but I think that there's a more insidious reason why the White House has put out the 1776 Project. And unfortunately, I don't think it's much about history. I really don't.
Well, I agree that there's a reason that they did it at that time. It was that cynical reason. But I think what they're thinking of as what they're using at this cynical moment is this particular kind of anti-racism. They're exploiting it. But I see what you mean. I understand you.
Yes.
Let me step in here and move us along. The California legislature is currently discussing reparations in the state of California. As a Californian, I found this fascinating, partly because I am a student of California history and know that California came into the Union in 1850 and banned slavery by consensus in its constitution. I've also reflected on the history of America through the lens of California, a place where 1 in 10 residents in 1860 was from China. just a very different history than the rest of the United States. But this seems to be motivated in part by things like the 1619 Project and that lens on American history. And I wonder, Professor Harris, how do you respond generally to calls for reparations and to this particular effort by California, which is maybe special?
Right. That's a great question, and a great question about California history as well. So California did outlaw slavery, but it also drove blacks out. And when I think about reparations, to be honest, I don't think about slavery. I do think it would be very difficult to figure out how to do reparations for slavery. But we also have a history of redlining in this country. We have a long history, a 20th century history of Jim Crow segregation. And so I would be interested in looking at the California Reparations Act to see if it's dealing with those issues, where the state definitely does have a history of racism, of what do they call covenants for property ownership, and any number of things. So the other thing I'll say about the California's example is that these calls for reparations have a longer history than the 1619 Project. If you recall, it was maybe 2 or 3 years ago when the House became Democratic, they did a series of hearings. And I'm forgetting his name, who did the series on reparations was it for the Atlantic or? Yes.
Coates?
So that, excuse me?
Ta-Nehisi Coates, you mean?
Yes, Ta-Nehisi Coates, right. That was another moment when, and this is in agreement with John, when these issues rose to the fore, not simply around slavery, but around post-Civil War segregation, redlining, property ownership, differential wealth. So the question of reparations has, surprising to me, become much broader than it had been before. So I'll be curious to see where California goes, because you're right, it has a somewhat different history from the rest of the nation in terms of slavery, but its history of racial segregation is more similar to, say, that history in northern states and in western states.
We've got time for one last question, if you could try to keep it to about 2 minutes each. And I want to pose it to both of you. If you had to give young Black people a message about how to think about 1619 and 1776, what would that message be? And if you'd like to add, if you were to talk to an Asian American student or an indigenous student or a new immigrant from Ethiopia or Syria, would that message be the same or different? John, why don't you go first?
I would say that in terms of what makes America unique, that 1776 or various years thereabouts are absolutely crucial, and I would try to explain to them why and get beyond the flags and the songs, because it can be hard after all this time to really understand why it's significant. I would tell them that this land was built on the backs of unpaid laborers, enslaved people. I like that new usage, actually, enslaved people, and that went far back beyond 1776, and that the whole nation's history has been a grand rehearsal, and that we're not even at the dress rehearsal part now. But frankly, I would also tell that young Black person to resist the idea of supposing that the entire history of the United States must be reduced to a story of how well people were doing in learning to think of Black people as equals. I find that to be a bare bones, dishonest, hopelessly oversimplified, and even sometimes unempirical account of what the history of the United States of America should be. And I would tell that young Black person, don't think that what makes you special is to make claims along those lines, as opposed to you doing what you as an individual find that you are good at and that you like. Now, as for the Asian person, it would be a variation on that. I would say, understand that Black people have a history in this country, that history continues all the way through to, for example, redlining, and that some, and I would tell them not all, because you have eyes and you can see it, but some of the discrepancies between white and Black people today are due to that legacy, and so you should realize that there's nothing wrong with Black people, and that's why you should know some of that history. But, after I had said those things to this hypothetical Black person, I'm raising two who are about to be those Black people, and then the Asian, I'd be done. As far as I was concerned, that's what they need to know. Then they're going to go off and do one of the 999 out of 1,000 other things they're going to do, as opposed to thinking about issues of race in America. I hope that doesn't sound glib, but that is my honest answer to that question.
Professor Harris?
I wouldn't say much different from John. That we have to understand both moments. I would say there are many other moments we have to understand. We also have to understand 1619, not just in the place of the United States, but also to understand our place in the world. That, 1619 is part of a longer history of Europeans in the Americas and their interactions with Native people and their interactions and coerced migration of people from West Africa that happened long before 1619, but it's intimately related. 1776 was a critical moment in beginning to turn away from a system of slavery that, although it looked like other systems of slavery, had really become much different in the Americas. And the reason for me that 1776 has power is because people said, I don't want to be enslaved to Great Britain. Their example of slavery was the enslavement they participated in right here. And the powerful call for freedom was because of the wrongs that they felt that they had enacted, that many of them felt really conflicted about that. And so the message is not that it's not just that there was a big problem, and there was, in terms of the ideals of freedom and the continuation of slavery. It's that how do people think through that? What were the limits on their thinking? And why did it take so long for it to end? I think these are important questions because we need to understand how change happens historically. If we want to make change, we have to understand that you can't just drop out. You have to be committed. And sometimes you have to have generational commitments over, my parents, their parents, and their parents before them were committed. Similarly with these issues in the 19th century, we have tales of intergenerational struggle and possibility. The same issues come up for anyone who comes to this country, particularly from other countries, I think. What drove you or your family to come to the U.S.? Those ideals are definitely within the ideals of 1776. And yet, we also have this example of when things did not match up to those ideals. And as John said, African Americans have been here for a long time, and I would take a lot of the language that he used to talk with someone who is a recent migrant here as well.
All right. Well, thank you so much for a wonderful exchange of ideas, Professor John McWhorter and Professor Leslie Harris. I'm going to throw things back to our hosts, and I hope you both have a great day.
Thank you.